It's finally time. Flowers of the Far Fields, my debut novel, is finally ready to be shared with you all. I am super excited to share it with you all, and really I can't wait to see what you'd think. This channel has been kind of a passion project of mine, and in that vein, I don't want you to worry about supporting the channel. I'm doing fine. I have a full-time job, which is why it takes so long for me to upload. But if you would like to support the channel in an indirect way and get something in return, then hey, this is an excellent way to do it. You can find it anywhere that books are sold online, and I'll have links in the description below, obviously. But before we get to that, let's read the back of the novel to see what you're getting into. In the early 19th century, an idealistic young botanist named James Torrey sets out to find and research the 6 rarest flowers in the known world. However, under the unforeseen pressure of weather, waves, and the crippling effects of isolation, he is forced to examine himself even more than the flowers around him. Happy memories of childhood give way before danger, betrayal, and loneliness. In the face of his own solitude, James must choose. Is a scientific work of renown really something he is after, or will he allow a more complicated beauty to grow through the cracks? Brewer's debut novel is a stark, poetic, and at times crushing story. From the heartlands of 1800s America to the verdant forests of Sumatra, Flowers of the Far Fields is a powerful exploration of struggle and the meaning of failure. Alright, one more thing before the sneak peek. I do have a full plan to do an entire audiobook of the novel in the future, but understand that this is something I will have to do alone, and these things take time, even with the audio equipment I have. But if you can't wait, the novel is there and ready for you. So, without further ado, let's get to Flowers of the Far Fields. It took only 2 months. On the 3rd day of the first week of December, I was informed by my guides that the time had come. A scout had already been out to the spot where the A. titanum grew. It was ready for us. Our party had everything packed in 2 hours, and by the afternoon we had started our hike into the forest. We made the trek without horses, and I became quickly aware of the difficulty in carrying all my notation supplies by myself. The journey did, however, give me more time to admire the rainforests of the island. We were lucky, and it did not rain the whole day. There had been a camp set up near the bloom in preparation for my visit, and I marveled at both the kindness of the Sumatran people and the uncanny detail in Marco's preparations. The corpse flower is said to only bloom at night, and the whole day I was shaken by tremors of excitement and anticipation at the coming dusk. My chest also tightened with a small amount of fear. Most of my botanical observation had taken place in American greenhouses, where blooms and pollination lasted for a whole season, not a few hours, because they were artificially prolonged by the careful hands of gardeners and curators. Nonetheless, I had confidence in my education, and spurred on by the idea that such a close observation of the corpse flower had never been attempted before by an outsider, I walked briskly through the dense vegetation, only steps behind my guides. I also initially wondered at the size of my traveling party. The monks were not exactly talkers, and I felt a little awkward being flanked by 4 other men on what I had assumed would be a semi-solitary expedition of 1 or 2 members at most. Soon, though, it became evident that these companions carried much appreciated conveniences. One carried only a lamp and enough oil to last 3 nights if needed. Another carried food for the group and was an expert at preparing the correct amount to keep the party going. The third had brought a machete and various bags to hang food off the wet ground at night, away from the animals and bugs of the soil. I had been under the impression that the machete would be used to clear the vegetation in front of us, but the monks stayed at the back, and I was soon made aware that the knife was not for clearing stationary organisms, but for protecting against mobile ones. Such an idea scared me when I thought of it, and I often found myself looking over my shoulder and listening closely to the many hisses and whispers of the forest. The 4th monk helped me carry my load of supplies, which I now found embarrassingly overzealous compared to that of my companions. The 4th was also the guide. He was an old man with an incredibly long face and uncomfortably upright posture, who I was told had found the flower on a walk almost a decade before. It was late afternoon when we finally arrived. And there it was. The plant, cocooned into a magnificent green pod, stood more than 3 meters tall. The veins of the single massive petal stood out as the bloom wrapped itself tightly around the velvety green spadix. I could barely contain my excitement. 3 meters looked so small written on the pages of a botany book, but what stood before me now was a monster of an organism. It was as if a leathery green bear was standing motionless on its hind legs, stuck in the perpetual stance of preemptive attack and domination. I could see the bleeding red tinge around the edge of the cusped petal, signaling its transition into bloom. The spadix, round and almost phallic-looking, added to its off-putting nature. To my surprise, I could not smell anything, but when I brought this concern to the guide monk, he chuckled, tilting his head to look at the pinnacle of the green spire. At the end of his laugh, he touched the bulbous petal with one hand and said only one word in English. Wait. It took only a day. The next evening I was preparing my sleeping cot near the trail when I caught a whiff of the foulest stench I had ever smelled in my life. It was like a combination of rotting flesh, feces, and sugary alcohol. The smell was pungent and strong, and it soon became omnipresent throughout our camp, seeping like a syrupy fog into every nook and cranny of my tent. Thrilled by this, I quickly left my previous duty of gathering kindling for a fire and approached the pillar of a plant. Sure enough, the petal had slowly begun to unfurl, exposing the worm-colored skin of its inner layer. I cannot describe the experience adequately in writing, but it was as if the plant held dominion over the whole area. Its titanic presence was expanded atmospherically by its vibrating aroma. Whatever the scent touched belonged to the giant, magnificent obelisk, and it sat like an effigy of some floral god that expanded its eminence invisibly across the forest. The smell, the monk said, spread for miles during bloom, attracting as much attention from the surrounding carrion bugs as possible. And bugs there were. Flies surrounded its tall spadix like a black halo, and members of some strange species of blue-black beetle could be seen crawling up its stem. As we walked around the camp, we had to make sure not to step on the wriggling river of insects that made pilgrimage to the bloom, encircling it in a spiral of legs and wings. The plant lay to the left of a narrow trail along a sloped embankment, which was perfect for observation. I could witness its unraveling petal from the trail below, and when needed, I could walk up the slope of the hill and look into its cavernous maw from which the spadix protruded. Within 4 hours, the petal had fully opened, and the entirety of the flower could be seen from above. I walked up the hill, grappling on the slippery trees of the embankment with my uphill hand. The lantern monk followed close behind, holding the lamp on a long pole to give me light. I wanted to see for myself the rings of the smaller flowers on the inside, a description of which I had ravenously searched for in any textbook on the subject, but failed to find. The 2 rings, though known about from dead specimens, had never been scientifically observed in bloom, the reason mostly being their invisibility from the outside. The A. titanum was already barely known to the scientific world. An observation of the flowers would normally require cutting a hole in the outer petal, preemptively stopping an already short bloom and killing the legendary plant. But with my high vantage point granted by the grace of natural chance, I peered into the chasm of the opening flower bud. I saw them, grotesque in their alien-like appearance. The 2 rings attached directly onto the central spadix were situated on top of each other and only centimeters away from the base of the plant. The male flowers resembled the yellow kernels of American corn and formed a skin-crawling hive approximately 7 centimeters wide. Even more horrifying were the female buds. Situated directly below the males, the females each had a tiny round red bulb jutting out from the milky yellow underbelly of the spadix. Tiny black, spore-like stalks, topped with round white orbs, sprouted from each bulb. Each of these stalks, unearthly in their appearance, curved upward toward the light of my lantern, and I could see the hair-like fibers of the orbs, ready to receive the pollen of their higher brethren. "Watch," said the lantern monk beside me, and with a grin, he lifted the lantern above the Titan arum and slowly wafted it above the spadix. The lantern itself was vented at the top and bottom, and as he jockeyed it with the long staff, the flame began to flicker violently as it passed over the top of the flower. After the 3rd or 4th pass, it blew out completely. leaving a wisp of smoke that quivered with the Titanum's noxious breath. We were plunged into darkness, and he let it stay that way for a moment, leaving only the crushing weight of the vapors floating around our heads. Then, after almost a minute of silent night, he struck a match once more and relit the lamp before we descended. The whole experience was otherworldly, and after a minute or two I had to draw back and take a breath. Quickly I descended to camp and wrote furiously in my notes. This process was repeated all throughout the night. I flew back and forth between the slipperiness of the slope and the light of my tent, gathering measurements, writing descriptions, and taking in the magic of the largest flower in the world. My buzzing industriousness lasted all the way until morning. We stayed until the bloom closed, a process that only took about 32 hours. As the first cracks of sunlight peered in through the thick hanging foliage on the second day of our observation, the wilting had already begun. By the time the warm dawn crawled its way through the obscured horizon to the foot of my tent, the red top of the petal could no longer be seen. The spadix had collapsed. The greenish-purple leaf had already turned a pale brown, and this was enough to dissipate the intangible aura that had surrounded the flower the night before. In surreal fashion, the spell that the monolithic flora had cast over our camp, and over however many kilometers such a magic could spread, slowly vanished, sucking itself back into the dying flower with the lethal sunrise. I felt the weight of the situation lift off my shoulders. My notes had been taken, my scientific data collected, but even with this feeling of accomplishment, I felt sad to see the flower wilt so easily and so soon. In a way, it felt like a small god of the forest had died in front of me, and its idol, the only corporeal manifestation of its power, was now to be overcome with moss and bugs and lay dormant for another few years, sleeping in the coffin of its fading aroma.